Alright, you might remember that a couple videos ago, I made a video titled The Conversation That You Need to Have. The conversation in question being what you want to happen to yourself after you pass away, or what your loved one wants to happen to them after they pass away. Now, for obvious reasons, that's not really a topic we like to discuss. Not really dinner conversation material. But if you watch my video, you realize that it's still very important that you have this conversation. For one, people will assume their loved ones will know exactly what they want, and in reality, they actually won't. Or another thing that can happen is that they will know exactly what you wanted, but because you never actually confirmed anything, they'll be constantly second-guessing themselves. They're going to be like, oh, I think this is what Grandpapa wanted, but if I'm wrong, he would be so disappointed in me right now, or something along those lines. So it can cause a lot of unnecessary stress on a family that's already grieving. And if you love your loved ones, which I assume you do, given the title of loved ones, you probably want to take off that stress after you pass away. Now, the reason that I'm bringing all this up is because shortly after making that video, I ran into a YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician run by Doughty. And it's exactly about what you probably expect it to be about. So I watched a video. And then I watched another video. And then I watched like 20 more videos, and you probably see what happened from there. Now, you'd think it'd be really weird and creepy and probably give you nightmares, but it's actually not creepy like you'd expect it to be, and it's filled with a lot of information that people should know a lot more about. Or maybe I'm just crazy. That's also possible. But I'm really hoping for the first one. In any case, that channel made me realize that there's a lot more that needs to be talked about. So I decided to make a part 2 to that video. And in the spirit of Ask a Mortician, I'm going to try to keep this video a lot more lighthearted than I did the previous one. The previous one had a far more serious tone, so I'm going to see if I can get you leaving with a bit more of a pep in your step after this one. Now I'm going to start with home funerals, which is another thing that's exactly what it sounds like. Now, if you think that's really weird, I don't blame you. It took me back at first as well, because frankly, it's just not really something you see a lot of. It's just a kind of an odd and unfamiliar concept, but after I looked into it, it actually makes a lot of sense. So just hear me out on this one. First of all, it's a bit less expensive than just a traditional funeral, because you don't have the whole funeral home to pay for. And then the other thing is that it gives you a lot more freedom to what you actually want to happen at the funeral. For instance, let's say it was your dad who passed away and he was a major cricket fan. You could totally have a completely cricket-themed wedding. Or perhaps he was a major anime fan and he wanted JoJo-themed placemats and Kuro-sensei ornaments on each table, and he wanted the priest or whoever would be giving the speech to be dressed up as All Might, and he wanted the speech to end in Plus Ultra! You could totally do that as well, or you could just have a simple funeral. Either way, there are several benefits to doing an in-home funeral. Now, if you do decide to do an in-home funeral, it still will probably help to have a funeral director help you actually organize everything, prepare the body, so on and so forth, because unless you're a funeral director yourself, there's probably a lot of technicality that you're not very familiar with. And you probably want to make sure that whichever funeral director you choose is somebody that's pretty understanding as to why you would want to have a home funeral. I hear that some of them can be a tad bit insistent on having a traditional funeral for whatever reason. So, just go ahead and shop around a bit. And of course, there are downsides to having a home funeral. For instance, if there's any leakage of the body, you're kind of the one responsible for cleaning that up. Now, of course, health-wise, that's not really that big of a risk as long as you properly wipe it up and thoroughly wash your hands afterwards. Unless, of course, we're talking about some sort of specific illness like Ebola. But other than that, you should be fine. And if you decide to embalm the body, the rules may change a little bit. So there is a lot of research you gotta do if you want to do a home funeral, but that is absolutely an option if you decide you want one. Now let's talk about another option, cremation. Now, as you know, cremation is something a lot of people do, whether it's because that's what their loved one wanted, it's more convenient, it's less expensive, they needed to transport the body from one point to another long distance, and it was easier to do it after cremation. Whole bunch of reasons why you'd want to do cremation. And I can understand why you'd be hesitant about it, because there have been a few horror stories That's right, tri-state crematory. Caitlin warned me about you. But overall, you should be fine with most crematories if that's the way you want to go. Of course, there's a couple things that you should probably know before getting into that. First things first, you're not required to use a casket for cremation. You can if you want to, but you don't need to. They can provide like a cardboard or wooden box thingy, which should work just fine. And most people probably don't want it or don't care about it because, you know, you're dead. But if you're one of those people who really don't care about being in a fancy casket before you get cremated, then go ahead and make sure your family knows that so that they don't need to spend the extra money on something you don't care or don't want. Now, another thing that you need to know about cremation is that there's a thing that you can do called a direct cremation. I didn't know about it until recently, but essentially what it is that you cremate the person almost immediately after they pass away. There's no real ceremony with the full body or anything prior to cremation. You just cremate them, which is definitely a less expensive option for a lot of people. But if you're one of the people who somehow managed to sit through all my blabbering at this point, you know that there's a couple things you need to know about before you go ahead with a direct cremation. First thing is that you don't want to rely too much on location. Shop around a bit, even if it's a little bit more far away, because with a direct cremation, it doesn't matter as much how far away you are. And the prices for cremations can drastically vary from hundreds of dollars. So you probably want to go ahead and look around a bit. And when you're looking around, you definitely want to ask them for their all-inclusive price. That just means that they include all of the services, everything that's actually going to be needed, so on and so forth, so that you actually know the entirety of the price as opposed to just the price of the cremation or something along those lines. And I suppose it's worth briefly noting that there's a new kind of cremation called alkaline hydrolysis. The very, very, very simplified version is that it uses really hot liquids to cremate you instead of just like extreme heat or fire. The benefits being, of course, that it's greener and more efficient and so on and so forth. But as far as I can tell, it's illegal in a lot of places. And I'm not entirely sure why. As far as I can tell, it's not any more of a risk of blowing up or catching on fire than a regular crematory. And I can certainly understand why a lot of people wouldn't want their loved ones to be cremated like that. But I'm not entirely sure of the benefit of making it illegal or what it's protecting us from. Maybe I'm just not in the loop, but I figured I'd mention it. Now this next topic is a lot more specific to certain people. Gold teeth. What do you do with them if the person passes away? Well, when it comes to burials or cremations or things like that, generally speaking, you can pretty much just leave them in there if you want. I wouldn't really recommend trying to get them out unless they're very sentimental to you, because cost-wise, it's not a great idea. Because unfortunately, you can't just yank them out, or at least for the most part, not legally. Because look, here's the thing, you can't just ask the person who is preparing the body to take the gold tooth out because they're not a qualified dental worker, so you actually gotta go find one of those. And then after you find one willing to work on a dead body, you actually gotta pay them. And generally speaking, the amount that it actually costs is more than whatever the tooth is worth. Because keep in mind that gold teeth aren't 100% gold. If they were, they'd be too soft to use as teeth. So they're a mixture of a bunch of different metals. Because of that, the amount of gold in the tooth is usually not going to even come close to the price it takes to pay somebody who is okay with working on dead bodies to yank it out of the person's mouth. And if you might be thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll just get the person cremated and then collect the gold teeth from that. Well, that doesn't work either, because that kind of gets mixed in and you really can't separate it after they get cremated. Now, last thing you need to keep in mind. What if the person who passed away is unfortunately overweight? Bit of a sensitive topic, but it is very important that you keep this in mind when you're taking care of a loved one who passed away that just so happens to be overweight. Now, first things first, when you're working with a funeral home or a funeral director, you definitely want to make sure you tell them the person's actual weight. I know that can be very hard, of course, but it's very important that you do, because depending on what size the person is, you may need specialized equipment, and if you don't tell them their legitimate weight, they might arrive with the wrong equipment, which causes way more complications than it needs to be. Now, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but when I'm talking about just like a really big person, I'm not necessarily referring to people with just like, a couple extra jelly rolls. I'm really talking about people who are just unfortunately morbidly obese. Generally speaking, that's when you need to start worrying about special equipment and making certain preparations and so on and so forth. Now, unfortunately, it does tend to be more expensive when we're talking about these situations. It takes more people to carry the body. You need a special crematory that has a much larger container for these size people. It takes more time and energy to cremate somebody who is morbidly obese. So generally speaking, it's going to cost you more. Now, of course, there's a couple exceptions, like caskets. Sometimes they can just take out the inside of the casket, and then somebody who is much larger can fit in something that size. Now, one thing that I should probably mention relating to caskets is that one thing that cemeteries have a tendency to do is that they'll dig up a whole bunch of plots and prepare them before anybody even dies. This way, when grandmama passes away, you can just give her money and toss her in. Now, unfortunately, this can bring up a lot of complications when we're talking about somebody who is morbidly obese, because these holes are not dug for people who are that big. So you might have to have the cemetery redig the hole, and that might cost some money. And then on top of that, you might have to pay for more than just one plot, because they're going to be using up more than just one plot. So this is all stuff you definitely want to keep in mind. And with that, we are coming to the end of this video. Hopefully your interest in this channel isn't something I need to have a funeral for. If you guys have any other things that you think people need to know about before dealing with the passing of a loved one or whoever, then go ahead and leave it in the comment section down below. And let me know if you guys like this little guy. I'm trying him out, so I want to know if you guys like him, don't like him, but would like to see a few things changed about him. Leave that in the comment section down below as well. And if your interest in this channel is still alive and well, make sure to hit that subscribe button and that bell button. I post every other Sunday, and until then, hear nothing and listen to all. Bye guys!